Hey guys, welcome to another video for biology. In this video, we were taking a look at the phospholipid. This is one component that makes up the phospholipid bilayer, or the cell membrane. And there's two basic parts. You're looking at the phosphate polar head, which is hydrophilic, which means it is attracted to water. And then there's another component to it that we haven't mentioned in class before yet, but it's the glycerol molecule. It's a carbon-based molecule that attaches the polar head with the non-polar tail, the fatty acid chain at the bottom, the yellow part you see there. And that is hydrophobic, meaning that it repels water. It wants to get away from water. So highlighting or magnifying the phosphate's polar head, you're looking at the molecular structure of the phosphate group that is on top. Now, technically, there is another molecular group at the very top, that R group that you see there. We haven't discussed that in class, and we're not going to. We're not going to get that deep into the molecular structure of the phosphate head. Just keep in mind that there is a phosphate group that gives it a negative charge, and then you also have the phosphate that has a positive charge because those oxygen elements are attracting the electrons, or pulling the electrons away from the phosphate, giving it a more negative charge, which gives it that attractability to the water molecule on the other end. That is why water and phosphate head, the hydrophilic head, the polar head, get along so well, because they're two polar molecules. Okay? And then you have that glycerol molecule in the middle that I was just mentioning, that glucose-based molecule that attaches the phosphate head to the fatty acid chain. Okay? And so here you see two fatty acid chains. They're non-polar, meaning that the charge is equally distributed. And when you look at the molecular structure of these fatty acids, you can kind of see how the molecular charge is pretty evenly distributed. You see how they're all basically made out of carbon. It's a carbon chain, a carbon backbone, and then there's hydrogens on each end of those carbon atoms. And that gives it a very stable structure and an evenly charged structure, so it's non-polar, meaning there isn't one side that is more positive or negative than the other. There isn't any opposite charges on either end of this. They're all the same, unlike the phosphate group that, if you recall, again, has a negative side and a positive side, just like a water molecule. So these are non-polar. These are fatty acids. They do not get along with water, which makes them hydrophobic. Okay, keep in mind the lab demo that we did where we mixed water and oil, and the oil molecules, even though we shook up the container, those oil molecules still happened to find each other because they just didn't want to be next to water. They would just combine together, clump together, and then you would have those two divisions again with the oil and the water separating. And that's because oil is non-polar while water is polar. Okay, and that chemical makeup essentially helps to make this phospholipid bilayer, that double layer that creates an intracellular, the environment, the cellular environment inside the cell, as opposed to the extracellular, the environment on the outside. So it creates that barrier that controls what goes in and out of the cell. Okay, so that phospholipid bilayer is super paper thin, and it determines what goes in the cell and what doesn't get to go in the cell and what goes out of the cell. So it's a very heavily regulated environment, and that's super important because each one of these trillions of cells that's in our body is responsible for homeostasis. It is responsible for keeping that cell stable and controlling the environment on the inside so that all those millions of chemical reactions can take place in the cell without stopping day in and day out, second by second, even when you're asleep.